So, and again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to chat about, as Patty says, one of the things that's nearest and dearest to my heart, and that is looking at pelagic birds. Okay, now my controls aren't working, which of course, there we go. So I'm going to cover a range of things, spend a little bit of time talking about our offshore ecosystem, the California current ecosystem, and give you some sense of what it is and why it does what it does. Talk a little bit about what's a seabird, and then walk you through a day offshore, starting with the boat, and then talking a little bit about the different zones as we progress. Some of the other things we see besides birds, and then talk to you a little bit about what we've been seeing over the 5 decades that we've been running these trips. And finally close with some tips for a successful trip and give you some insight into what we've been doing this year for COVID protocols, which is a subject I never thought I would be covering in a Westport Seabirds, but this is 2020. So the California current ecosystem, couple different ways of looking at it. I really enjoy the one on the left, just for 2 reasons. One is because it's gives you the really big picture of what's going on in the Northeast Pacific, and 2, the graphics are actually related to a Seattle area oceanographer, Kurt Ebbesmeyer, who has had the ingenious idea of studying ocean currents using objects that are inadvertently released into the ocean. And in this case, he tracked where an entire shipping crate of Nike sneakers ended up once the shipping crate got washed off of the vessel. As you can see, it was as it was nearing the Gulf of Alaska. And ignore the sneakers, but just take a look at the blue arrows, and you can see coming in from the west, the North Pacific Current arrow, just a little ways south of the Aleutians. That actually originates over in the western North Pacific. Ultimately, it's sort of linked to the Kuroshio Current, the famous current off Japan that runs northward. And that ultimately bends east and runs all the way across the Pacific south of the Aleutians as the North Pacific Current. And as it nears the North American coast, it sort of bifurcates, with part of the water going north up into the Gulf of Alaska, forming the Alaska Current and the Gulf of Alaska Gyre, and then the other part going south and becoming the California Current, which runs off of our coast. For us, it's often fairly far offshore, but we're still part of the general ecosystem. As you get further south off California and off of Baja, it's right offshore before it finally bends out to sea again. So to zoom in on that and zoom in on some of the complexity then of the California current ecosystem, it has a seasonality to it. And this graph over here on the right does a great job of showing the spring, which is also kind of the summer as well, strongly dominated by the southward current itself, the rich offshore current called the California Current, with then some side currents and even occasional eddies. In the winter, though, the California Current is still there, but it's dominated actually by the Davidson, a northward moving current that's fairly close to shore and is somewhat warmer. So we get 2 really pretty different regimes in our ecosystem. Zooming in even a little bit more, our continental shelf has several features that are actually sort of unusual, or at least one that's fairly unusual worldwide, and that is it's quite broad. Not broad as in Gulf of Mexico broad, where you can travel for 80 or 100 miles and still be in water that's not much over your head. But for a cold water, rich current driven, it's pretty broad. Further south off of even Southern Oregon or California, it's much, much narrower. And that breadth gives us a lot of productivity, because the wind-driven upwelling over the continental shelf bringing up the nutrient-rich cold water from the bottom over a broad expanse of our offshore area creates very rich feeding grounds for a broad range of marine organisms, including seabirds. The shelf edge is punctuated by numerous submarine canyons. Those are their own sort of niche within the larger ecosystem, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about birds. But those are areas often where even if there's not much wind-driven upwelling going on, there's topography-driven upwelling as the deep water currents hit the edges of the submarine canyon walls and well up to the surface. We also have the luxury of quite a few large estuaries, and I'll use my pointer here. The Strait of Juan de Fuca drains one of the largest estuaries in the world, the Salish Sea. Grace Harbor, Willapa Bay, and then the Columbia also providing a very large estuary. So we get relatively estuarine conditions near shore that is, and most of you are quite aware that estuaries are often nurseries for marine ecosystems. And that really also adds greatly to the productivity of our coastal ecosystem. Birders from the east who come out and are taking their first West Coast pelagic trip are often just amazed by the number of birds they see, because our Atlantic ecosystem is nowhere nearly as productive until you get well north, up into the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy area, and then even further north into the Canadian portion of the Northwest Atlantic. Some oceanographic features of our area that we pay attention to when we're out there, and we look for our areas, well, several different things going on. One is upwelling. I've mentioned that already. Both the wind-driven and the topography-driven or current-driven upwelling. And we can see notable differences between years. Another is salinity. Our area is often referred to as the dilute domain, meaning it's several parts per thousand lower of salinity than true pelagic water. And that's because of the very large freshwater inputs from the Salish Sea and from the Columbia. And they, to some extent, get held near shore by the offshore currents for quite a ways. So we have this lens of slightly less saline water, and birds can tell. We rarely see, until we're well offshore, we rarely see species that really prefer higher salinities. And then as this demonstrates, you can see these plumes of intermixing. This is a temperature gradient here, but the temperature gradient means there's also these waters have different chemistry, they have different levels of nutrients, and so that generates a lot of interesting mixing, these plumes, and then the gyres that get sometimes generated within the plumes as well. So it can be a really complex environment offshore, based on it, all driven by the different forces that are the upwelling and wind forces, but as well the currents, both surface and subsurface. So switching from that to trying to answer the basic question of what the heck is a seabird. And first, it's kind of okay to make up your own definition. There's a lot of definitions. There's no universally accepted definition. But I think it's fair to say that for Washington birders, when we think of seabird, we think of birds that you only rarely glimpse from shore and you have to go offshore, or birds that spend large amounts of their time offshore and you always feel a little fortunate or lucky to be able to see. So for us, that's the tube noses, which is a very big family of everything from albatrosses down to storm petrels. And it's also a few species of gulls like Sabin's gull or kittiwakes in the winter, a couple of the terns, in particular Arctic tern, many of the alcids, two of the phalaropes, but particularly red phalarope, and then the Jaegers and skuas are sort of that's our universe of seabirds. and I've shown photos, and I'll confess, this photo right here in the lower right is the only photo of something that you don't have much of a chance of seeing off Westport. I will, now that I'll start to kick in more and more bird photos, and I'll just quickly, before I move on, identify each. Rhinoceros auklet in winter or non-breeding plumage. Oh, and I have to move my, this is a parasitic Jaeger subadult. A shot of phalarope showing both red and redneck flying together. You can see the back color difference. The red having the grayer back, and the rednecked typically a darker back. Depends on plumage, so that doesn't always work, but it is helpful. And then finally, my cheater shot. This is the snowy population of wandering albatross, and I just kind of had to throw it in. Because that is most truly a seabird, spending a year or more often at sea, circling the globe, north of Antarctica. That's kind of quintessential seabird. I think all the others sort of aspire to be as cool as wandering albatross. So with that background, that orientation, hopefully you're ready to head offshore. Black-footed albatross is one of our specialties for Westport Seabirds. They're a bird that really likes the dilute domain, likes the broad continental shelf. So our shores are really in a lot of ways tailor-made for black-footed albatross. Off California, some of the trips get them, but usually in ones, twos, low numbers. Some of the other trips off California, black-footed albatross is a not always seen bird. So we're kind of right in the epicenter of where black-footed albatross are happiest. So our boat, we've been using the Monte Carlo since the 80s. Skipper is Phil Anderson. He's also the owner of the Monte Carlo, and he's sort of a core part now of the Westport Seabirds gang. As you can see, well, first off, this is an older photo. There's a lot more really cool electronics in there now, and just briefly, one of the things we've learned, I'll talk about commercial fishing more later, but if we know where the commercial groundfish boats are harvesting, that often we'll choose to just head right for them. And he's got a display now that lets him see where the boats are 30, 40 miles offshore. It's pretty slick. And not just where the boats are, each boat individually displayed. The new electronics are pretty cool. A couple other points. We do have an emergency raft. The boat is, as you can see, looks really good. Phil does a great job of keeping it in shape. All the latest radio gear, radar, everything else. We are safe going out there. And there's typical shot of birders hanging out, staring off the stern. So the inner half of the shelf, which for us usually takes about the first hour or so of travel in the morning, just to get out to the 50 fathom depth, and a fathom is 6 feet, so 300 feet. We call those the shallower waters. Very strong coastal influence in that nearshore area. Again, highly productive, so it's not a wasted hour and a half, but by and large, you're seeing birds that you can also see from shore. But what I always remind people is you're not on shore anymore. And things that are solid, like like your feet on the ground, aren't quite so solid. So it functions well as a great opportunity to stare at birds that are reasonably common that you're going to see a lot of, but get used to using your binoculars in a challenging environment. And if you look at enough sooty shearwaters, you're going to, as soon as you see a different shearwater, it's going to jump out at you. Same thing with common murres. So it's kind of a great initial orientation. And lots of days we see pretty good numbers. This is actually a small flock of sooties. Sometimes we see them in just dense rivers that are just awe-inspiring and make you really think about the amount of food that must be down there to support that number of birds. Some of the other birds in the nearshore environment, I mentioned common murre already. Pelicans sometimes hang with us for a ways offshore. And then parasitic Jaegers, so that's the Jaeger we we most commonly see close to shore. Once across the 50 fathom line, we begin to see a greater diversity of tube noses in particular, but also of alcids too. This is definitely more marine dominated. This is typically a zone, we think of this all the way out to either the shelf edge or to the edge of one of the submarine canyons. The bulk of the commercial fishing that we encounter happens in this outer shelf. And again, this isn't salmon fishing, this is fishing for whiting. This is fishing for rockfish or shrimp, pink shrimp, things like that. Why do we head? Well, first off, some birds of the outer shelf. In the winter, this is where black-legged kittiwakes are. In the spring and fall, it's where we see numbers of salmon skulls. It's always where we begin to see our first Cassin's auklets. And this is where we begin to look really intently for South Polar skuas as well. Lots of other birds too. I didn't want to clutter the slide up too much, but this is where it gets exciting. This is where you kind of start to wake up and realize that any bird you're looking at could be new or different. So why do we talk a lot about commercial fishing? Well, here's one photo of why, and I'll show you a couple more. This is a trawler fishing for whiting. Is it? Oh no, sorry, it's rigged for shrimp. This is fishing for that little Oregon pink salad shrimp, which they fish for with trawls. And typically it's a pretty clean haul, and almost all the catch comes up inside this trawl and goes on board. But there's some small amount of juvenile rockfish, juvenile smelt, and other things that also get caught, and they get sorted and put back overboard. As well as, even though the gear is pretty efficient, when it comes to the surface, lots of times a little bit of the catch will pop out of these meshes. And seabirds have learned that. And so they hang right over the net as it comes on board. You can see here's another shot here. The corks of the trawl are on the surface, and the birds are all anticipating the net bobbing up in just a moment. And some birds are really scavengers. And here's the primary scavenger, northern fulmar. Northern fulmar is a widespread bird throughout the colder waters of the Pacific, North Pacific, as well as the North Atlantic. Well known as a scavenger in all those areas. And it's thought that their numbers have increased dramatically as a result of commercial fishing. Certainly they occur in very large numbers. And any of you who ever watched that kind of silly reality show, Deadliest Catch, and could see swarms of birds going around the boats in the halogen lights, those are almost all northern fulmars that are remaining in the Bering Sea for the winter because of the commercial fishing activity there. Most years we get lots of fulmars, non-breeders, because they're there in the middle of the summer, but they're down there mostly because of the level of commercial fishing that goes on off our shores. You've probably heard some about, well, here, let me just show a couple more slides. Again, here's another trawler. This one's a rockfish boat, and you can see the number of birds in the wake. They're probably sorting the catch now as they go, and that's what birds are going for. And then this is one, you may have heard some about this and the issue of albatross, in particular mortality. This is called the longliner, and you can see the albatross around it. They're very attracted to longliners. And if the longliners aren't fishing carefully, there is indeed seabird mortality associated with longlining. But over the years, the bird conservationists have worked really closely with industry and worked out several really effective techniques for minimizing albatross mortality, and it's working. You can see it in terms of the numbers of albatross building, not just in the northern hemisphere where these were pioneered, but actually now that they're being adopted in the southern hemisphere, they're helpful there as well. So now we kind of welcome seeing a longliner because it's often one of our best views of albatross is hanging around those longliners. Finally, we get to the submarine canyons offshore, and typically the one that we head for is Grays Canyon because it's the nearest one to Grays Harbor. All we have to do is cruise due west for about 30 plus miles, and we get to the eastern end of Grays Canyon. There are other canyons to the north and south of us that we sometimes visit based on wind and water conditions. Sometimes it's easier to run to the southwest or to the northwest than it is straight out, or because that's where we can see a lot of commercial fishing going on too. So it's nice to have our choice of canyons, but Grays Harbor is kind of our home, and that's likely where you'll go. The depths change really quickly. The shelf edge is around 100 fathoms, 600-foot depth. As soon as you go over the edge of the canyon, you can just watch the depth sounder drop really rapidly and very quickly. Within quarter mile to a half mile, you're in 1,000 and then 1,500-foot depth. Really steep topography, as I mentioned, that drives local upwelling. So even if there's not a lot of wind-driven upwelling and a lot of productivity on the shelf for some reason, the canyon's usually pretty good. And so what we try to do is just head straight west, right down the canyon, and till we finally get out the west end, which is around 38 miles offshore, 37, 38 miles offshore. And we will stop there and put out a chum for about an hour or so, right out in the really sort of surrounded by deep water, which is often very productive. And the chum that we use, well, let me switch here. The chum that we use is designed to attract mostly tube noses, but also Jaegers and other things too. And we use a mixture of, we combine vegetable oil and menhaden oil, which creates a nice smelly slick on the surface. Totally non-toxic though. It's not harmful to anything. If birds get it on their feathers, they can easily preen it off. But tube noses do a lot of foraging by smell. Those nostrils are there for a reason. And you can see, it's so much fun to watch when there's a decent breeze blowing. And once we put that slick out, you can just watch things like the storm petrels or even the big albatross, just sort of hound dogging it back and forth across that scent trail towards us. Other birds forage more visually. This pair of long-tailed Jaegers here, for instance, are visual foragers, but they see activity behind our boat. They come over to check it out as well. So we also put some suet out on the water too, just beef suet. And that, as you can see, this albatross right here, a little bit of beef suet in its beak. They love the beef suet, which I'm pretty sure we're not hardening their arteries, but I couldn't tell you for sure. We get great close views of albatross at the chum spot. You can see close enough that we can even read color bands on them. And we enjoy, when we find a color banded bird, we enjoy reporting it and learning about virtually all our birds from the bands are coming off of either Midway or the Sand Islands or other islands associated with the Western Hawaiian chain. We also get different alcids out there. These are Scripsis murrelets, tiny murrelets that breed primarily off of, on the Channel Islands off Southern California and into Northern Mexico and disperse north after breeding. We're about the northern limit of their range. Some years we see them sort of frequently, meaning once every second or third trip. Other years we're lucky to see a pair. I didn't really mention the fork-tailed storm petrel before, but this is another of our birds. Fork-tailed storm petrels are much harder to find further south, much further south off the California coast. And so this is another sort of Westport Seabird specialty. You'll see numbers of fork-tails most trips. The bird in the center here that looks like a sooty shearwater isn't. It's actually a short-tailed shearwater, the very close look-alike. You can see it's got slightly rounder head, slightly shorter beak. And if you had it in comparison with a sooty, you'd see the body size is a little smaller, but you can't, doesn't show in this slide. Typically a deep water bird as well. Even though they occur by the tens of millions in the Bering Sea and stream past us in the late fall, we only get the very edge of their southward migration Some years we get to see decent numbers in the late fall, like 20, 30. Other years, if we see 1 or 2 per trip, we're feeling pretty good. So always kind of an exciting species to see also. So again, I said, you know, your pulse kind of quickens when you go over the 50 fathom line. Your pulse really picks up once you get out over the canyon and head for the chum, just because, again, who knows what'll show up there. We don't look just at birds. We're just as infatuated with the mammals out there. And we get a pretty good diversity, and it's just something about the way some quality time spent with marine mammals will really just make your day. It can get just magical. And I've just included a small sampling of what we often see. In the pinniped range, elephant seals, both sea lions, and then these 2 shots, both of northern fur seals, which are kind of real clowns. This one's sort of jug handling, which they often do. This one stopped jug handling and decided to look at us. We recently discovered, and this is so exciting, that we also get an occasional Guadalupe fur seal. That's another species. The northern fur seal primarily breeds in the Bering Sea. There is a small population, though, in one of the Channel Islands as well. Guadalupe fur seals bred mostly off Mexico and into the Channel Islands were actually thought to be extinct, but a small number survived. Through conservation efforts, the population has grown, and it turns out that every once in a while they range as far north as Washington. And so we've learned that when we see a fur seal, we can no longer just say, oh, that's a northern fur seal. We actually have to look at it pretty carefully to sort out which species it is, which is one of those really fun problems to have. But the cetaceans really steal the show. A common whale offshore nowadays is humpback whale, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. It used to be that really the only whale we ever saw much of was gray whale, and that, as you know, they stick pretty close to shore. But we do occasionally see other species of baleen whales offshore. I finally got my state lifer blue whale just a month and a half ago. It was epic. I was thrilled. We see killer whales several times a year. We have been able to identify individuals well enough to know that we sometimes get the southern residents, the salmon eaters. We know we also fairly regularly see both the transients and the offshores. Transients are the marine mammal eaters that will also come into Puget Sound, and then the offshores almost never come in near shore, as is their name, and they're fish eaters again, like the southern resident killer whales. Dolphins, Dall's porpoise and harbor porpoise, which I don't show here, are our 2 commonest ones, but we often see a fair number of Pacific white-sideds, and we can get into some pretty big schools of them. This year, a couple times we got into schools of 500 to 1,000. And that's just one of those, you shut the engines off and you just watch them for a while. Also because there's usually birds with them too, so it's like a twofer. This odd looking critter is a northern right whale dolphin, which we're super excited when we see, and we do about once a year, sometimes with the Pacific white-sided, sometimes with other species like Risso's dolphin. But it's just, it's cool as heck. It is so streamlined, so sleek, but tough to get a good view of too. This was a really fortunate shot. In addition to mammals, a few things that we see almost every trip. Ocean sunfish, truly bizarre. Just a completely unique life history. They primarily eat jellyfish and by-the-wind sailors, Velella velella, and this is by-the-wind sailor. And as a result, they accumulate fairly large amounts of toxins in their body, so they don't have to worry too much about anything else eating them. And so they're big, they're slow, they just laze along at the surface with some of the densest flesh known to anybody. I'm told that the really big ones, occasionally when they're struck by the big ships crossing the Pacific, they can actually tell, because this will actually, hitting a big old sunfish will actually stop the propellers for a bit. They're that dense and large. This is the fin, the caudal fin of a blue shark. We see blue sharks pretty regularly out there, often at our chum spot, and sometimes swimming right up next to the boat. It's a 4 to 5 foot shark at mature size, so it's not impressive, but it's cool to see a pelagic shark, and we can often get pretty good looks at them. Then we leave the chum spot, turn around, come back in, and but we're coming back in the daylight. We often leave in the early morning light and can't see much in Grace Harbor, so I chose to put this at the end. And back to the bird life and mammal life of Grace Harbor. The sea lions lounging on the channel buoys. Recent years, Brandt's cormorants have been nesting on the rocky edge of the marina at Westport, as along with young Olympic gulls, brown pelicans roosting. In good Heermann gulls years, they can coat the docks. And we've been enjoying in recent years a flock of godwits that roosts in the marina, and every once in a while, in addition to the 500 to 1,000 marble godwits, occasionally in the fall, hosts a bar-tailed as well. Kind of fun to have bar-tailed godwit on your pelagic trip list. So that's the day. So we've been doing this for a long time. My first trip was actually in 1973. But Terry Wahl, who founded Westport Seabirds, actually started back in, I believe he ran the first trip in either 67 or 68. And by 1969, he was offering several trips a year because clearly there was an unmet demand. So we have 5+ decades. Prior to Westport Seabirds, nobody was organizing pelagic trips. There was really no way for birders to get out there. And every once in a while, a professional ornithologist could get offshore through arrangements with a fishing vessel or something, but a very sporadic effort. So the first systematic coverage of our offshore zone for seabirds really began with us. And as a result of, we started, well, thanks to Terry's vision, we started off right. We kept track of birds in a systematic manner from really the first trips. So I have now at my fingertips 5 decades worth of systematically collected data, which is, many of you may have heard me say this before. I think I say it on every single boat trip, but it's one of the longest consecutive databases on seabird abundance, at sea seabird abundance anywhere in the world. Pretty exciting that we have that here in Washington, and equally exciting that you, the birders of Washington, really have supported that from the beginning. So what did we discover kind of from the get-go? Well, Buller's shearwaters, for instance, very striking, very lovely, probably the coolest seabird in the world in a lot of ways. We're essentially unknown off Washington and poorly known off the rest of the West Coast prior to our trips. Our sighting in 1968 was only the 2nd state record. Now it's known to be a regular fall migrant in varying numbers, but I haven't missed seeing Buller's shearwater in years. And usually at the end of the year, I'll have seen 500 or 1,000 or more. So kind of interesting to think that just a little over half a century ago, we really didn't even know they were out there. A little bit more recent discovery, short-tailed albatross. Thought to be extinct, but were formerly a fairly common part of the Washington offshore avifauna. We know that because their bones appear in a fair number of Indian middens from the coast and even into Puget Sound. So we know that they occurred somewhat inside. And there are specimens that were collected in Puget Sound prior to the population crash. So in the very early 1900s, there were specimens collected from within the Salish Sea region. But as I said, thought to be almost extinct, rediscovered. The population, though, when they were rediscovered, the population was under 20 birds. 12 to 15, I believe, was the number. And as a result, one of the world's rarest seabirds. It was in 1993, we saw our first short-tailed albatross, and I won't ever forget that. seeing that bird flying towards us was seeing a bird flying out of the mists of extinction. And you get goosebumps when you see something like that. Now they're a regular visitant in very small numbers. We don't see them necessarily every year, but we know from the amount of satellite tags that these young birds in particular, and this is a first-year bird, so spending its first full year at sea, we know that they visit off our shoreline fairly regularly in small numbers. Really cool to have them restored to our avifauna, and really an honor to have been part of tracking their recovery. Another discovery, more like the Buller's shearwater, flesh-footed shearwater. Again, only one state record prior to the start of our trips, and we now know that even though they don't occur in as big numbers as Buller's do, they're an annual visitor in small numbers and during both spring and fall migration. So we really, just by started to discover some things just from the get-go. But equally, because we're keeping track of numbers, oh, sorry, one more slide about that, and then I'll talk about keeping track. Over the years, we still haven't seen it all. We keep finding new rarities, new things, and things that just, you know, get you really excited. And I've just got a few examples here of some of the rarities that we've seen over the years. Great shearwater, which is an Atlantic shearwater, very, very rare anywhere in the Pacific. But they occur far enough south in the Atlantic, all the way down to Cape Horn, essentially, that it's not unexpected that every once in a while they might probably start to go north on the wrong side of Cape Horn, and then they're going to end up off our shores because it's a lot like the New England waters they inhabit in summer, in their winter, our summer. We saw our first great shearwater in 2002. We've seen 9 since, and we had these very puzzling 2 years, 2013 and 15, when we didn't just see one, we saw several. So clearly more than a single lost bird. But we haven't seen any in the last couple of years, but when we do see them, August seems to be the month. This little critter here is a California current endemic, the ashy storm petrel, but typically the California part of the California current. They breed off California. The Farallon Islands have probably the largest colony, and don't distribute very far north or south of their breeding range. So they really are endemic to the California current ecosystem. And it's only in recent years that we've realized that we get the occasional ashy storm petrel. 2 well-documented photo records and a couple of other sightings. The 2 well-documented records were both 2006 and 2019, both in June, oddly enough, but they're a fairly early breeder, and so these could be young birds dispersing a little further than the adults do. Brown boobies are showing a pretty dramatic increase in the eastern North Pacific, and have been for quite a while. We saw our first one off Westport, and that's this bird right here, in 2002. This coincidentally was both mine and one of my co-leaders, Bruce Labar's. This was our 400th state bird. We both hit 400 at the same time with the same bird, which is kind of fun. And then more recently, we've begun to see them almost annually, at least one a year. We've had 4 just during the 2013 through 18 time period. Didn't have one this year though. So here's a bird of the southern hemisphere that typically does not cross the equator because of the doldrums, shy albatross. But we had one midwinter in January of 2000. As you can tell, the camera technology back then wasn't quite as good, but we got really pretty clear photos of it. Another bird that's a conservation success that I'm hopeful we will begin to see more of is the Hawaiian petrel. We saw one in September of 2008. We know from subsequent, both the repositioning cruises and birders being on that, as well as offshore oceanographic surveys, that they are out there, typically a little deeper water than we can get to, but occasionally coming in close enough so we stand a reasonable chance of seeing another one of these. But Hawaiian petrel numbers have been really decimated for all the problems that most Hawaiian birds have, like rats. But careful conservation efforts have been restoring their numbers, so hopefully this will be a little less rare. Now I want to talk a little bit about changes over time. And one of them will be this Laysan albatross here. We don't get a lot of Laysan, even though they're the commonest albatross in the North Pacific, because they avoid the less saline waters that the black-footed albatross really like. They tend to stay a little offshore from the dilute domain. But we do get a reasonable number, enough that we can talk about trends. But let me first talk about a different trend, and that's Manx shearwater. Manx is another bird like great shearwater of the Atlantic. Doesn't belong in the Pacific at all. So consequently, we were really stunned when we saw a Manx shearwater, a clear Manx shearwater, just off the jetties at Westport on one of our pelagic trips back in 1990. And it was actually the first record of Manx from the North Pacific. A lot of skepticism about how do you know that's a Manx? There's a lot of other shearwaters that look like that. And a lot of the seabird experts and others were suggesting that maybe it was a different species. But this was just the beginning of a tide of Manx that now clearly has become a colonization by Manx shearwaters of the Northeast Pacific. So this is a bird, you know, of the Grand Banks, for instance, but they winter as far south as southern Argentina. And that's probably how they ended up in the North Pacific, is sort of taking the wrong turn around Cape Horn as well, just like those great shearwaters. But the Northeast Pacific appears to be similar enough to the North Atlantic, where they're a common breeder, that they've found a niche. And while nobody's found a nest, there's plenty of evidence that they've colonized islands off Alaska, islands off Washington, and potentially even further south. But the strongest evidence comes from off Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. Anyway, you can see our trend over time. When they arrive with kind of a boom. This is the first 5 years, 1990 through 94, sort of a similar number, and then a slow build up. I don't quite know how to explain this drop off other than potentially as birds colonize, the successful ones don't wander around as much. And if you're breeding on, say, Destruction Island, and foraging is good around there, you're not going to end up off Westport nearly as often as maybe the birds that were first really still prospecting the area did. Anthropomorphizing a little bit, but there is that dynamic exists in colonization, where the first individuals roam more widely, and then as the population really develops a local adaptation, birds really begin to make the most efficient use of their new environment. And so this may be just a transition. So we'll see what the next do. But if you want to see a Manx shearwater now in Washington, pretty much any day in the summer that you're willing to spend 3 or 4 hours staring through a telescope off of the beaches at Olympic National Park out towards Destruction Island, a Manx shearwater will fly through your scope. They're out there, they're consistent. So we know our numbers aren't indicative of the status of the population in general, but they still tell a great story of colonization. Here's a different colonization story. Laysan albatross have started to breed on the islands off of northern Mexico, off northern Baja. And those birds are thought to, based on banding as well as just inference, are thought to make use of the California current ecosystem as much or more as the birds from the Hawaiian chain, many of which, if you've read Carl Safina's great Eye of the Albatross, you know that a lot of those just go straight north and work the seamount south of the Aleutian chain. So you can see over time, we were seeing Laysans from the beginning, but back then it was a really rare bird. It was a once every year, once every couple years kind of bird. And enough to set the whole boat jumping up and down and screaming with joy. And you can see a clear buildup over time with a spike. Not quite sure what caused this one spike and then a bit of a drop off, but overall, this is a pretty strong trend line up. And we've really been enjoying that. There are years that are good Laysan years for us, and years that are so-so Laysan, but we're getting them every year. And if you go out, particularly on either our early or late in the season trips, you've got it's not a 50-50 chance, but it's a pretty good chance now of seeing Laysan, which is super exciting. A different story, and it's not a bird, but we pay a lot of attention to humpback whales because they're just, you can't not pay attention to them. They are so cool. As you can see here, humpbacks were essentially unknown to us for a very long time, maybe one a year, maybe. And then finally, the recovery really kicked in off our shores. And this very much mirrors the global trend, which started a little earlier, but this steepness of this rise has really mirrors it. And this is the recovery from the whaling, or essentially the overharvest from whaling. Long-lived species, slow reproduction, you would expect it to take a long time, but boy, has it. And it is every year now, we'll have one or two trips where we'll see over 20 humpbacks during the day. And it'll just be one of those days where they're full body breaches. You're watching them lobtailing. They're waving their pectoral fins in the air. You get a couple near you that sort of thrill everybody. And other days where, you know, your humpbacks are a couple distant animals that mostly you just see the blows and not much more. But your chances of seeing a humpback on any given trip now they're getting close to 100%. They're over 75%. And in the old days, your chance of seeing a humpback in a year or two might have been 10%. It's a breathtaking change. And it's just exciting to see. We're continuing to document it. We're taking photos that help with the photo ID database that they have for identifying individuals that Cascadia Research Collective maintains. It's not all good news, though. We've also seen declines. Here's one of them. You may be aware that the state of Washington has now listed tufted puffins as endangered. Our data certainly provide a strong argument for that. In fact, they use some of our data as part of the evidence for the listing. Tufted puffin was an every trip bird, usually several individuals when we started out. And you can see the trend line pretty strong, but there's a story within the deviations too. The 1990s were a set of years of consecutive years of much lower than average productivity, triggered by a fairly strong El Nino Southern Oscillation event in '92, and just persisting. Not the same as the blob that we've been experiencing in the last couple of years, but not too dissimilar. That really caused puffin numbers to crash. Bit of recovery, but it didn't persist, and they're back to dropping again. And this is mirrored by the counts from the breeding areas and other things. So puffin was a bird that we didn't always even stop for, unless one was really close and very photogenic. Now it's always a stop the boat bird whenever we get a puffin, and go get a good look at it. Kind of tough to see, but you can see this. You know, these are data that are collected while we're pointing out birds, while we're doing a lot of other things. So it's not rigorously collected in the way a seabird scientist would, but you can see the utility of these data in showing not just the decline, but even some of the reasons for the decline. This one should be familiar to everybody as another, and sorry about the photo here. I realized at the last minute, oh God, I need a murrelet photo, and it was the best one I could scrape up in short order. But you can see our decline in marbled murrelets. This certainly is reflective of the decline in habitat off Grace Harbor, because murrelets, we see them in the summer just near the jetties. So they're clearly birds that are breeding within a couple hours flight of the channel to Grace Harbor. So this is really just a change in a handful of individuals. But again, we could rely on seeing murrelets near the jetties on our way back in when we started. It was a rare trip when we didn't pick up a pair or two near the jetties and show them to birders. Now it's a stop the boat bird. And we'll only get a few a year. So again, our data correspond really well with all the other observations. Back to success stories. Brown pelican. We keep pretty close track on the numbers of brown pelicans, particularly in the afternoon. When we come back in, we can get some pretty good counts. And you can see, again, a really remarkable increase. The population as a whole had started increasing earlier, and brown pelicans were quite common, had recovered quite well from the DDT problems that they struggled with until DDT was banned. And then fairly quickly, within a decade, California numbers had rebounded, but they rarely came north. Even though when you read the accounts of the early ornithologists in Washington, it was clear that brown pelicans were part of the fall avifauna prior to the DDT years, really the late 1800s, early 1900s. So they did formally make use of the ecosystem, but for a long time, they were still absent from Washington, even when the population was looking much stronger off California. But oceanographers think a lot about the first very strong El Nino that was really felt in the Northern Hemisphere was 1983, right in here. And you can see this is just where the curve is starting to lift off the zero line. Because that was the first year that we saw brown pelicans, other than a very rare individual, where we saw small numbers in Washington. I tend to think that that was actually that ecological perturbation of very strong magnitude, in a way, did brown pelicans a favor, because in essence, by pushing them north out of California and into Washington waters, they were able to essentially recover what had formerly been part of their natural history to come this far north. And you can see from there, it was a pretty steady increase. Not sure what to attribute this to, other than conditions for pelicans well documented several years in the Sea of Cortez, as well as off Southern California, well documented nesting failures. And that may well be primarily what's going on here, but I haven't tried to line it up right. But you can see it's a decline from very high number to average numbers. It's not anything to get really worked up about. So as we think about the trends we've seen and what the future may hold, one of the things that we really worry about is these marine heat waves and what their impact is. Because what we know is in these marine heat wave years, we lose a lot of our wind-driven upwelling. Warmer waters also are less productive than colder waters. They don't hold as much oxygen, so they don't fuel as much photosynthesis. And I think you're all aware as well that warmer waters also tend to have a difference in their acidity and issues with ocean acidification as well. So you get a breakdown in the physical circulatory. You get water that's less productive, inherently less productive. You also increase the metabolic. Oddly enough, warmer water is also harder on creatures that are cold water adapted. Their metabolism rises, which means then they have to find more food to support a higher metabolic rate. But food is often scarcer. And so warmer water is not good news in a productive cold water ecosystem. And you've probably read a lot of the accounts of the blob, or some of the outstanding work that the COAST group, the citizen science group that does all the Beach Bird Survey work, they have, looking at their carcass trends, really clearly documented several of the effects of the blob on seabirds, and none of them are pretty. So we worry as we look at the future about the increased incidence of these. And you can see here's just from 5 years apart, 2 different very large scale marine heat waves. And these things persist. This is a gigantic amount of thermal energy. And thermal energy just doesn't go away just like that. It takes a long time to dissipate. It may disappear out of the surface waters, but it's often still lurking down in the deeper waters as well, and disrupting the ecosystem from down there too. So this is something we worry a lot about, but we'll be out there, we'll be tracking, we'll be recording, and sort of seeing where it takes us. So, sorry, I guess I, to some extent, close trends over time on a bit of a downer. So let's refocus. Let's think about when you're feeling comfortable and ready to go offshore again. Some things to just keep in mind in advance, because a little bit of advanced preparation and taking the right precautions can mean the difference between kind of a tough, little bit of a grueling day and a day where you just go, that was magical. And we want you to have that latter feeling. So doing some study in advance. I'm always surprised. Most people study when they get out there, but I'm always surprised a few people haven't done much homework, and every once in a while we get somebody towards the end of the trip saying, you know, I'm still trying to figure out the difference between sooty and pink-footed shearwaters. And if they tell us that while we're still out in pink-footed shearwater country, we can do something about that. But every once in a while, they don't tell us that until we're back well out of pink-footed shearwater country, and we pretty much have to tell them, well, you missed the boat. But if you study in advance, you're much more prepared, much less likely to happen. And if you are concerned about seasickness, or you know you have some proclivity, get some medication in advance. The patch, the scopolamine patch, works great for most people. I just chew ginger and eat saltines for a while, and then when I'm relaxed, I'm great. Whether that's placebo effect or ginger definitely has medicinal effects, I don't know, but it's worth it. Whatever kind of gets you in a good frame of mind. What's the Coast Guard cocktail, which is email me about it if you want to know. Anyway, it's a couple over-the-counter seasickness medications, also works well. Some of them tend to make you drowsy, and we suggest you avoid those just because you don't want to be getting drowsy at 11 or 12 when you're just out in the really good birding area. Also, a good way to avoid getting drowsy is to think ahead and prepare where you're staying to get a good night's rest. I can't stress enough about dressing warmly, and I make this mistake some too. You know, when it's a July day and I'm trying to pack my bag for a pelagic the next day and it's 90 degrees outside, it's really hard to remember that you need windproof, warm clothes, but you do. And that includes your feet as well. If you go out there in sandals, you're going to have really cold feet. Bring your own food and drinks. There isn't anything on board other than there's always a box or two of ginger snaps. I bring, as I mentioned, saltines, ginger ale, and then usually I do feel good and ready to eat a sandwich and have an apple for lunch or something. But definitely bring some food so you can keep munching on things. That often helps too with dealing with seasickness. And finally, some way to keep your optics dry. Remember your rain caps, but also some lens cleaning solution and a lens cloth. And with that, you're pretty much equipped for a good day out there. And then in 2020 and undoubtedly in 2021, we have to think as well about COVID. We didn't even start operating in 2020 until we canceled our first sets of pelagics until the governor gave the charter boats the all clear to start to operate. But even then, there was limitations on charter boat operations, and we follow all those scrupulously. They're important, they're there for a reason, and the last thing we wanted to become is have a pelagic trip turn into a super spreader event. And to our knowledge, of all the birders who came on board, nobody transmitted COVID, which we feel really good about, but we think there's several reasons for that. One is birders are conscientious. Two, we follow the guidelines. But three, you're outdoors. Very few people spend much time, if any, in the cabin. I mean, why be in the cabin when there's birds outside? We also, by limiting the the number of passengers we take. We're only taking half to 2/3 of what we would normally take. Definitely really facilitates social distancing. And so people who are particularly concerned about, maybe higher risk category or something, have not had a problem with maintaining social distancing. We require mask use inside the cabin, and we encourage it on the deck. And the vast majority of our customers, our birders, wear their masks at all times. And then as well, we remind all customers to do self-checks the evening before. If you're running a bit of a fever, you're feeling any symptoms, that we refund automatically. And we've had a few people sort of call us and the evening before, and say, hey, I am not feeling quite well, and have been responsible, stayed home, and then we've been able to work them in on a later trip when they are feeling good. So I think that'll be in place for most of 2021 as well. So it's a safe birding event, but if you want to wait another year or two, that's fine. We'll still be out there as well. I'm looking forward to when we can operate as normal. So let me close with just some quick acknowledgments. First off, this is Terry Wahl from Bellingham. Terry established Westport Seabirds in 1967 and went out on every single trip until 2005 or so, when he decided to hang it up. We miss him, but we really greatly appreciate his, not 2005, sorry, 2008. We really greatly appreciate his vision and how he set it up, both in terms of orientation towards the customer service, making sure that the birders who go out there, that we're not just the mode of transportation, that we're talking about what people are seeing, we're helping them identify it, and we're trying to educate them about the marine environment. He set that up, he set those expectations, as well as also, I've mentioned several times, our data collection. So we owe Terry a lot. Phil and Chris Anderson, who once we found them in 1985 and started working with them, we've never wanted to switch. They just run a great operation. And Phil and Chris too have both turned into really good birders as well. It's not uncommon for Phil to spot several of the birds that we end up pointing out to everybody. Westport Seabirds has been lucky to have a really great crew of leaders over the year. Every trip has 2 to 3 leaders on board, so we have quite a cadre, and we rotate it around among us all. Dennis Paulson was a leader for quite a few years, along with Terry. He doesn't lead anymore, but we sure appreciated the years he put in. Nowadays, some of the leaders are Bruce Labar, Scott Mills, Jim Danzenbaker, Cara Bore, Bill Shelmerdine. I forgot Gene Revelis, myself, many others. And without the leaders, again, the Westport Seabirds experience wouldn't be the same. But most importantly, the biggest acknowledgement really is the birding community. Not just from Washington, although it's the Washington birding community that's really been our core, our foundation of support. But we get a lot of birders from around the rest of the US. We get a lot of birders from around the world who've joined us offshore. So any given trip, you can be chatting with somebody and hear that they've come a long, long distance to see what we're all out there to see, and we appreciate that. So with that, really hope to see you all offshore sometime soon. The ocean always looks like that, I promise. And I'm happy to take questions.